There definitely will be situations where there's a moral outcome to a decision that an AI or a robot is taking. And we need to pay attention to that, and we need to be very clear about that. Algorithm will never have spirit, and the spirit for me is the seat of that creative originality that can push us beyond the boundary of what we've experienced before into something that's entirely new and creative.
Welcome to the Faith at Work podcast, sponsored by Servant.io. Servant is focused on helping faith organizations maximize their impact with cutting-edge tech. But this show is all about equipping you with wisdom and insights from Christians who are on the front lines of business and technology. I'm your host, Jake Oswald. Let's get into this week's episode. We have with us here today Professor Nigel Crook of AI and Robotics at Oxford Brookes University in the UK and author of Rise of the Moral Machines. Also, Ryan Collins, CEO of Bethel School of Technology and author of The God of Tech. Guys, thanks for coming on today. We're excited to get to talk to you both.
Thank you for having us.
Let's start out with your introductions in your own words. Nigel, if you wouldn't mind going first, tell us about your background and what you do for a living.
So I am an academic. I've been working as a researcher and teacher in computer science in the field of artificial intelligence and robotics for nearly 40 years next year. And I've worked on a variety of areas. One of my key areas is taking recent discoveries in neuroscience and applying them to artificial intelligence, in particular machine learning, to try and improve how the algorithms perform in terms of complexity and use of energy. So that's one of my main focuses. But my other one is in the area of ethical AI and in particular moral machines, which is a fairly recent scientific field of inquiry where there's a growing community of people from all sorts of backgrounds who are interested in how we can equip AI systems and robotics with some degree of moral competence so that they can be aware of the ethical and moral consequences of their own actions and words around people and how they should behave around people. From a sort of a Christian perspective, I'm a lifelong believer of Jesus Christ, and I'm actually a bit of a nomad in terms of the traditions that I've been involved in. So I started out as a Roman Catholic for many years, and then due to marriage, went to a Methodist church and became very involved in that. And now I'm in an Anglican church. So I've moved around a little bit. But just to give you some context in how my faith interact with my research and academic work, a good few years ago now, probably 15 or so years ago, I became very interested in how we develop our moral character as human beings, and in particular, how we do it from a Christian perspective. And this mainly came out of reflecting on my own moral or perhaps lack of moral behavior at times, and trying to understand how do we grow spiritually? How do we become like Christ in our nature? And I came across the writings of a Professor Dallas Willard. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's been very influential recently, and he had a huge impact on me. He opened my eyes to the possibility of being able to change and not to be stuck in the same place, struggling with the same things. And it transformed my life. And part of what he teaches helps us to understand how we are formed, how we transform into Christ-likeness. And I've spent the last few years looking at how I could merge together my interests in developing social robotics and AI that is interacting with people, where we want those systems to have an understanding of what is acceptable behavior and how well they should perform, with my sort of amateur interest in character formation. And I've actually started to sort of publish papers in that connected area between the two.
Very cool. Discipling robots. I love that. All right, Ryan, how about you? Give us your background.
Oh man, so I'm the CEO of Bethel School of Technology. We launched about 7 years ago as the first online Christian coding bootcamp in the world. I think we're still the only one. So the idea that you could equip believers with the most in-demand tech skills so that they could go into what I believe is the most influential sphere of society, which is the tech space, and serve companies with excellence in both skill and character, and usher the presence of God into this space where the drive-by narrative is that God and science and technology are mutually exclusive. And so there's just too much beauty and brilliance in science and technology to believe that God doesn't have a plan and a purpose for it. And so that has been my journey. We're about 3.5 hours east of Silicon Valley. I would say one of the most influential zip codes in the world. And we knew that there'd be churches and ministries that would be cheering us on, but we started getting invited to Facebook and Google and Apple. And it wasn't even the tech skills that they were curious about. It was the fact that we taught things like communication and culture of honor and healthy relationship and
Hmm.
community. And these are all biblical values, but they're the same types of character skills that these companies were investing millions of dollars to improve their workplace culture. So we had a seat at the table at these major tech companies because of our character, because of our biblical values. And so that was really exciting. It really opened my eyes to the opportunity and the possibility that that could take shape if you were to actively engage the space and represent the love of Christ in the sphere. So yeah, that became the impetus of the book that I wrote. I released last year, The God of Tech, and the idea that God has a plan and a purpose for technology, and that it's a tool that takes on the function of its user. And if we can use it as a tool and not see it as the solution, but a tool that points to Jesus as the solution, we could see a massive move of God, the likes of before we've never seen, because of the opportunity to reach so many people through this beautiful space. So yeah, that's a little bit about me and my background and what I've been up to the last few years.
Tell us about AI as it pertains to Bethel College. Is there a particular interest in that? Is it growing?
Yeah. So we started our flagship program is full stack software development. So when we looked at the job market back in 2017, that was the most in demand skill. So our program is a vocational program. It's an accelerated learning program. It's a boot camp. So really just in the most simplest of terms, you get in, you get out, you get a job. And there are over 200 coding schools in the US alone, a lot of great coding schools, but ours was a little bit different. The secret sauce, the unique part of what we were doing was that we added that spiritual component to it. And so people come into our program that want to do things bigger than themselves, that they know that they're going to be transformed, but then they get to carry that transformation into the atmospheres that they're engaged in. So it's really exciting to see what our students have been doing over the last 7 years. And as part of our program, we've since expanded. We have UI UX design, we have cybersecurity, we have data analytics and data science. And the data science and data analytics would be kind of precursors or in that same path as AI and machine learning. We teach Tableau, we teach databases, we teach Python as kind of our core language. So a lot of our students start there and then start moving after,
Hmm.
once they get jobs, they start moving into learning more about AI and machine learning.
Gotcha. Cool. Okay. Next question. I have this little Rolodex of questions in my mind. I'm trying not to forget any of them. Nigel, now you got into AI long before it was probably even called that, right?
It was called artificial intelligence, but only I think it sort of that title came to the discipline around the sort of late 50s, I believe. I have
Oh, wow.
to check. But it just was not very popular. In fact, I don't know if you're aware, we've had at least two AI winters. These were periods of time where it was not considered proper to be studying artificial intelligence.
Why not?
And I've lived through at least one of those where I would not admit in a public setting that I was a researcher in AI. People would just not understand it and would actually frown upon it.
Why was
And
that, and
those,
when did those occur?
so they occurred. So the one that kind of just preceded before I started was in the sort of late 70s, early 80s. And the reason it happened is there was a lot of hype. All of these winters are preceded by quite a lot of hype about the promise of AI, what it's going to deliver within the next 5 years and so on, which obviously wasn't then satisfied.
Hmm.
But the particular thing that hit in the 70s was a paper that was published that demonstrated that the current way of AI systems learning, so-called neural networks, was limited, and the algorithms could not learn complex problems to solve. And it was very convincing, and almost immediately it cut all funding to AI
Oh, wow.
research. Government funding was cut. The focus was changed to other things. And I came into the field just as we were coming out of that a little bit. And I was working in an area which we then called expert systems. And it was a medical diagnostic application I was working on, the work of clinicians in working with premature babies, helping them to understand and to diagnose the condition of the babies and understand how to treat them. But my focus was on explaining to the clinicians why the system had made that diagnosis,
Hmm.
which in the time wasn't really a big topic, but now is very big. I mean, explainable AI, XAI as it's called,
Hmm.
is a real hot topic now.
Okay, follow-up question. If I met someone who had been trading in the stock market for, let's say, 50 years, and they'd seen multiple booms and busts, that's the guy I want to ask for advice because he's probably going to predict the next one. You've seen a couple winters. It feels to me like anybody my age would never say we're about to enter an AI winter. So, would you say that, hey, they're always preceded by a boom, that's what's happening now, or no, this time's different?
This time is different. This time is different because of the commercial value that has been generated by the
Mm.
technology and the investment that huge investment that companies are making in this technology. So we're definitely in a different context to what was before. Previously, the systems that were being developed were largely developed as small scale academic systems that could solve some very well focused problems and do them sometimes quite well, but they didn't scale up.
Hmm.
And often many of the institutions involved in that kind of work didn't have the resources to really expand the work. And as soon as we had the development of the large language models, so those are the technologies behind ChatGPT, for example, that are able to produce high quality sequences of words or tokens that look like they've been created by a human being. As soon as we get that, and organizations saw the value of that and could then invest in the computing power, and they gather the significant amounts of data that these models needed to train, then it rocketed, and then it became public, and the rest is history.
Hmm.
So, in terms of are we coming up to another winter, it's very interesting. What we're finding now with the technology is that although huge amounts of investments are still going in, we seem to be getting diminishing returns in terms of the improvements in performance of the technology
Hmm.
per investment. And it feels as though it's flattening out a bit. Whether that will continue or not, I don't know, but there's an indication that it might. And the other thing that is quite interesting in this space is that a lot of the content which is being used to train these models actually generated by generative AI
Hmm.
itself. And I heard a figure, and I don't know if it's true, that 57% of text on the internet now has been created by generative AI
Already in the
already,
in
which
the
is
like year or
amazing.
two.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh
which is
my
amazing.
goodness.
Now, so then what happens is there's been a recent study published this year, which was very interesting, which showed that what happens if you take the output created by a generative AI and feed it back in to train the next generation of the model, it starts to produce gobbledygook. The technical term is model collapse, because it just starts to get fixated on certain areas and they become more and more highly probable to be picked by the model. So there's something has got to happen in that space where genuine human output needs to be acquired, used to train the next generation of models rather than just regurgitating largely what these models have already created. So I think there's an interesting time coming where I don't think it'll be a winter in the way it was before, but there are some technical challenges that we're going to have to face to keep up the gain in performance of these models.
You're talking about like source data that informs the model.
Yeah,
Does that need to
yeah.
be, do we need to produce that now? Or would you say like it exists and we just have to tap it?
So it exists in the sense that these models were trained on the whole of the internet, plus a lot of other content.
Mhm.
So that's what trained the original sort of GPT, generative pre-trained transformer models. But what's happening now is as more of the content becomes generated by the models themselves, then the quality starts to drop in terms of having the variability and the creativity that the human contribution has. So that's an interesting thing. And what may happen in future years is that actual genuine human content, either text or human created images or whatever, could actually become very valuable to the industry because they need that to stop this model collapse from occurring.
How does that circle back to the morality issue? Is there a connection there, you think?
There's definitely a connection between the source of data and the morality that these models demonstrate because they're developed with a pool of data that is not curated. So, just to explain a little bit of the background, I worked on chatbots about 15 years ago. I had a job as a researcher down at Oxford University for a couple of years, and we worked on a European project called Companions, which we developed an animated avatar that you could have a conversation with.
Hmm.
Now, the thing is, back 15 years ago, we would have smallish amounts of data, but we would choose it very carefully. We would select it so that it actually produce sensible results and the kind of things that we would want to output. What's happening now is that everything is thrown into these models. And of course, what it spews out is the good, the bad, and the ugly, which means that these models have a tendency to say things that they ought not to say, to generate things that might be offensive. And they can still be tricked into doing that. If you know how to prompt them, you can fool them into saying things that they ought not to say. So I think, despite the fact that the organizations developing these models are putting in guardrails, which they are, there's still a risk because the underlying process is statistical. It's basically rolling a dice to decide which word to say next, and the dice is weighted by what the probability of that next word would be. And so there's a kind of a semi-random bit as well, which means you're not in full control of what it's outputting, which is a problem if it's outputting things that are not morally appropriate.
Yeah, that to peek that far underneath the hood for the average layman, if something like this is handling moral issues, feels like, whoa, not cool.
And it is.
But okay, but would you say I'm imagining the Supreme Court, for example, right now, it's the best thing we've been able to, it's the best version of how to handle moral issues in our country, in the US, that we've had so far. And I don't even know how many seats there are on the Supreme Court now. Let's say there's 8 or 9. It feels like a person would be appointing a model in the future. And the model has a specific morality that's been designed, that's
Mm.
unique. And then each of these models has a seat on the court. Is that reasonable? Like, help me think through that.
So I think the problem is we can certainly help these models to be more moral in the outputs that they generate. That can be done, and that's all down to whatever data we train it and how we help the algorithm itself to be careful, in scare quotes, about what it generates. But my issue with this technology is not conscious.
Mm,
It's not a human being, and it doesn't have an innate moral compass
mhm.
or a conscience, and that puts them in a category where they're useful for some things, very good wide range of applications. They can produce good and helpful services to support business and society, but I would not want them to be judges of anything.
This is interesting to me because years ago, I was in a business incubator as a young man, and there were a couple of graduate students who had designed this tool that at the time they're talking about ML and AI. It was like the meat and potatoes underneath the hood of what they were doing. And it was ballistically matching bullets on crime scenes with an extremely high degree of accuracy. And they were sort of like saying, hey, in the future, there will be less people who are wrongly convicted of crimes they didn't commit because of artificial intelligence. And then I started to see all this other research that was produced that was like the average human judge is actually really biased. And the variability between sentences is very high, depending on who the judge is and who the plaintiff is and who the defendant is. And there's not a lot of actual true consistency, even though we trust ourselves to be moral. And so there's these conversations around this could tighten that in a little bit. So that's me as a layman. Hone that in for me. Where am I wrong?
Well, it's not that you're wrong. I think the problem is that these systems some of them are already in use and they've not got a great track record already. I don't know if you're aware of the Compass system
Mm-mm.
used in the US by police forces, I think, or at least the judicial system in the US, to decide whether prisoners are likely to reoffend. And it was trained on actual data on prisoners released and then being charged again
Interesting.
for reoffenses. The problem with it was that it turned out to be very racist. If you're a black minority or whatever background, you would be rated more highly as a
I see.
likely person to
It
reoffend than a white person, and that was to do with the balance in the data.
it sounds like you're
So
saying it conflated causality and correlation.
yes, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
I heard that before. I hadn't thought about that. But that checks out with how I understand how these models work.
So, just as a side thing, in the book in Rise of the Moral Machines, I've included 4 short fictional stories. One of which is actually the opposite of what you're saying, which is the first robot to be put on trial for a crime.
Can
And
you
the
tell us a
idea,
story?
well, it's a very short story. I can give you the highlights of it.
Yeah.
So, the story is of a robot that is charged with theft and murder. It broke into a drugstore, took some drugs, stole a car, and went to its home. So those are the offenses that it committed. The backstory is that the robot's carer is a lady human who is terminally ill and in desperate need of medication. And the medication that it stole from the chemist was medication that she needed, and it needed a car to get home quickly enough to deliver that medication. But in doing that, it killed somebody to steal the car. And so the whole sort of story is told around the relationship between this woman who's dying, seeing on television her robot, which is under her care really as a sort of a developing robot, being in the dock in the first ever trial of a robot. And as the camera sort of pans round the jury, she says to herself, and they promised him a fair trial, not a single robot in the jury. So I'm just trying to push the boundaries a little bit in our thinking and just what would happen? How would we feel if we got to that place?
This reminds me of the last conversation we had, Ryan. We talked about, is it the trolley problem?
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. And this is fascinating. That story, it sounds like a Philip K. Dick novel, or and what you were talking about, even with almost like pre-crime with Minority Report and things like that. It's yeah, the trolley problem, Jake. A few years ago, and Nigel probably knows this, but just talking to some of the folks that work at Google Brain, and as they were building out self-driving technology, the ethical dilemma of just because they can build something, should they, and who wins and who loses in potentially life-threatening situations. If you've got a car that is run off of machine learning and artificial intelligence, and it's in a situation where it could either he has to choose. It could either hit somebody outside of the car or, crash and kill the person in the car. Who does it save? Does it rescue the person inside the car or outside the car? And so I think those are the things that it gets really fascinating to me when I think this tool is a beautiful, sophisticated predictive analytics mechanism that can help us in a lot of ways, but it should not be used to replace, human discernment, human connection, and intuition. And I think as believers who believe that God created the universe and he made man in his image and we steward his creation, that there's a certain intuition that's built inside of us that cannot be manufactured. And so, and I actually use the trolley problem in my book, and I talk about the idea of, you've probably heard these stories where somebody has gotten stuck under a car, a 2,000-pound car, and just defying all odds, a 110-pound woman will lift the car off of her father or something. And it's like, that should never happen. And yet it does. And if we were to just use pure analytics and data, a machine would say, that's not that's not the best course of action, because
Hmm.
that doesn't make any sense. And I just think that it's important for us to understand. And that's what fascinates me, Nigel, about the rise of the moral machines. And I get this question a lot, like, are we in danger? Are we, I think a lot of people too need to understand the difference between generative AI and artificial general intelligence and the AGI in this moment of singularity. And it's like, well, only if we allow the computers that we built, the machines that we built, to actually tell us who we are. And so I would love for your take on that. And that trolley problem too, Jake, is just for background, is this exercise in ethics in the late 60s, early 70s, where you had this exercise of, okay, you've got a trolley and it's got two paths. One path is heading towards one person who it would kill, but then if you divert it, it would kill five people. What do you choose and why? And so I think these are the types of thoughts and the types of things that individuals are having to think about whenever they're building a tool that could potentially have such a powerful impact on people's lives if we allow ourselves to allow the machines to dictate who we are and what we do.
Nigel, could you speak to that? Especially the AGI piece too, like what that is, what's the difference, just for the average person?
The AGI, so AGI is artificial general intelligence, and this is where artificial intelligence, which currently can solve very specific problems extremely well. For example, diagnosing breast cancer from scanned images outperforms human beings currently on that very consistently. There are a number of other areas where machines are outperforming what we would call the intelligence of human beings, and kind of that's then seen as, if we continue in this direction, then surely there'll be a point when there's machines are just generally tackle any kind of problem, and we're not there yet. I don't believe we're there yet. I think we're actually a lot further than most people think. And the reason that I think that is that these machines are not conscious. They don't have empathy. They have no lived experience of what it is to be a human being, which is why I also would agree with Ryan that we have to be extremely careful about how we develop machines that are making moral decisions. They're already making moral decisions,
Right.
and the vast majority of them are morally naive. Um, I can give you an example that I quote in the book about a robot that came on the market in 2016-17 called Jibo. And it was a lovely robot. It was a lovely little platform. It was about the size of it looked like a desk lamp, a rather plump desk lamp with a head that swiveled round and a screen on the head. And it was treated like a kind of member of the family.
Hmm.
And there's a promotional video which shows it interacting with the mother who's baking, and it's taking photographs whenever it sees an opportunity to take a photograph. And at the end of the video, it's showing it in this sort of girl's bedroom telling bedtime stories, which all looks wonderful. But the last shot of the promotional video is the face of this girl with a green box around her face and her name underneath it. And what really struck me about that is this is an internet connected device
Mm.
that could put that child at risk. And the robot has no concept of that whatsoever. It is morally naive. So I think that is a big issue. And I think coming back to the trolley problem, which I also talk about in my book, because such a key thing. And I do actually know of one major UK car manufacturer. It's looking at autonomous technology that is using that as a way of trying to think about the ethical problems of autonomous vehicles. But my take on it is that this is really it's a philosophical dilemma. It's not meant to have an answer. It's meant to highlight that there's a problem. And originally, it was developed to illustrate the differences between two different philosophical approaches to ethics. One is consequentialism. So, what are the consequences of your actions? And your ethical decision making should evaluate the consequences of that and try and get the best outcome for everybody involved. And the other one is called deontology, which is really about your moral obligations. What are you morally obliged to do in that situation?
Mm.
And in the trolley problem, it's commonly depicted as a train track with a runaway cart, as Ryan says, going down the train track. And on the track in front is 5 people who are going to be killed. And then on a siding, there's one person. And you're stood next to a lever that could be pulled, and either the trolley will, if you pull the lever, it will divert and kill one person, or if you don't, it'll carry on and kill the 5 people. And that's all about, do we look at consequences of actions? So should we take an action to avoid bad consequences, or
Right.
should we not be involved in the killing of a person? So by pulling that lever, you're making a moral judgment that that one person's life can be taken and the 5 not. So there's a whole kind of thing about that. But the reason why I tackle it in the book is because it doesn't translate very well to the autonomous vehicle or context.
Hmm.
Because autonomous vehicles are not on tracks. People in the trolley problem, the people will be tied, often depicted as being tied with rope on the
Mm.
track, so they can't get up and walk off. Whereas people in a normal setting would be able to move and may even be able to jump out of the way of a vehicle. And so there's all that. And then the decisions that the car has to make is look at all the different possible steering angles it could take, all the different braking, acceleration combinations. And then at the end of it, figure out with all the physics models that it's got, how far it will get, whether it will reach a certain place, how
Yeah.
hard it will hit somebody, what the consequences of that will be. And then after all of that, it has to make an ethical decision.
Right.
That's the hardest part of it at all. So I think it doesn't, I'm not sure it really helps in the real autonomous vehicle
Right.
context, but it does help, I think, to show that there will be situations, there definitely will be situations where there's a moral outcome to a decision that an AI or a robot is taking. And we need to pay attention to that, and we need to be very clear about that. I don't know if that helps, but that's my take on all
Yeah,
of it.
what you're saying is this is merely a philosophical allegory. It's just helping us to understand something that's intellectual. But the real world, there's an infinite number of variables that are happening that we're consuming and using to make decisions. So it's almost the likelihood that anyone ever actually encounters, human or robot, a true trolley problem is almost zero, at least in the
Almost,
physical world, right? But
yeah.
what's interesting is if I'm just giving the devil his due and playing ball here, I, as a human, mathematically have the ability to take in way more information, I think, than a robot does. And I'm categorizing all of that in way more buckets. The context is way richer. So for the robot, yeah, that's not just 2 variables, but it's not 2 million. Maybe it's 200,000. So there's less variables. So it's almost like even though it's still highly unlikely, it's potentially more likely that the robot does perceive its situation as a trolley problem because it doesn't. Does it make sense? It's
Because it's
unaware of the
constrained.
way out of it.
Yeah, it doesn't have a sense of smell, doesn't feel vibrations. It doesn't. So does have limited sensory input, and that certainly has to be taken into account when we're thinking
Hmm.
about these systems. So yeah. And the other thing I wanted to pull out of what Ryan was saying was about I think you mentioned, Ryan, didn't you, about the sort of the technological singularity, which is something else that I tackle in the book, which I think is very interesting. The point at which machines become smarter than human beings, and which for many people is an inevitability. And just very briefly, the way I tackle it in the book is to say there are two perspectives you can take on this. One is biological. And if you look at biology and compare human biology, and particularly brain anatomy, to our sort of other animals, even our sort of closest relatives, I suppose, I argue in the book is that the wetware in the brain is like orders of magnitude more computationally powerful even than the smartest animals that we could compare ourselves against, because of the numbers of neurons in our cortex, the outer part of the brain, and the numbers of connections. So that's one side of it. So in a sense, from a biological point of view, the singularity has already occurred. We are it. Um, but I also argue it from a creational perspective. And if you look at the story of creation in the Bible and how it begins with very simple light and dark, very staged creational steps, you can see the complexity of the animals and the birds, increasing plants and then animals and birds over that period, that creative period, to the point where you get humans being created, but not just like any other animal, but actually being touched by God. And we have what is referred to as the Ruach, the Spirit of God. So we're not just biological beings, we're spiritual beings by virtue of creation, which to me is the ultimate singularity. I mean, that is the the highest. Like, we are like God in a sense, in that sense. So I think there's a lot we can say as Christians that speaks into that fear that people have.
Ryan, the floor is yours to respond to that. I don't even know how to say, like, what to say to that. I had never considered before that spirituality is the singularity. That's something that will never be replicated. I'd always heard the singularity defined as all knowable knowledge known instantly. That's different from spirituality.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is the, that's the difference. And when you have that piece of the origin story, then that's where our identity comes from, and that that really shapes everything that we do, how we perceive each other, how we perceive ourselves, and even how and why we build the tools that we build. And so I think it's fascinating. And the Bible does say that God made us in his image. He imagined us, and that we are also co-heirs with Christ. We're seated in heavenly places. I saw a recent Barna stat that 80% of Americans believe in a spiritual dimension. And so I think that more and more people are realizing that there is this other realm that interacts, that's part of our world. And even from a science and technology perspective, Nigel, one of the things that that's really fascinating to me is the I think the upcoming tipping point of quantum computing as a commercial product. And I think just yesterday, Google launched Willow, and it was able to compute exponentially faster than our fastest supercomputers. But just the kind of the non-intuitive nature of how quantum mechanics and quantum computing operate, the superposition and the entanglement of subatomic particles, and in just connecting with different people at these tech companies, and kind of the race for quantum computing supremacy, and hiring all these particle physicists and quantum physicists. And as they dissect the atom into its smallest parts, they can't understand how these subatomic particles are behaving, in particular the superposition and entanglement, what they would call phenomena. And the only rational explanation is there has to be a guiding force or another, something in another universe that's causing these to behave this way over. And this goes back to string theory and the Big Bang theory that, so they've taken God out of the equation, but they're actually saying the thing that we know, that there is a God, and in him all things exist and were created and are held together. And I actually believe that science in its purest form is the study of creation. And when you study creation, it's an invitation to know your creator. And I feel like there's a move of God that's going to come from a very unexpected place, because the drive-by narrative is that God and science are these, there's a line in the sand, they're mutually exclusive, but I think they're intrinsically and eternally linked. And that as these scientists and technologists study the most confounding parts of our universe, it will lead them to an encounter with Christ. And that's what fascinates me. And even going to Nigel's point about we're a long way off still from artificial intelligence being what it is. I actually, and I talk about this in the book, I think that we are nearing the end of one epoch, and and the next epoch will begin with quantum computing. And I think that even, if 150 years ago out of Cambridge, James Clerk Maxwell and Michael Faraday, they discovered, these are spirit-led believers who discovered these incredible parts of our universe and science, that light was an electromagnetic wave, and that you can manipulate these waves and transfer information from one place to the next through seemingly empty space. This is the foundation of our modern technology, and it was all coming from spirit-led believers. And then over the course of 150 years, it feels like the church didn't engage that, which is what is so wonderful for me and what Nigel is doing, because he is doing it from a posture of being a child of God. And then, the encouragement, the activation of the body of Christ engaging in this conversation and being a part of it, because I believe that even the way that the next epoch with quantum computing will be actualized, because it does have such a non-intuitive dimension. It's like 1 Corinthians 2:6-16, when the Apostle Paul says that we have the mind of Christ, that God reveals his wisdom to us spirit to spirit, and it's incomprehensible to man apart from God. I think that's where we're going with science and technology. And the only way to fully actualize it is to have that revelation that God is creator of the universe, and that he made us in his image, and that, Romans, where it says, God's invisible attributes, his divine nature and eternal power, can clearly be seen in his creation. So I don't know, Nigel, if you think I kind of went on a tangent there, but that's where I see us going. And I think that AI is the culmination of one epoch that was started 150 years ago, and quantum is kind of the next season of this wonderful era of science and technology that will point to God as creator.
No, I do see that, and I think that we will get there. I still feel that we're way off, aren't we, to scaling up that technology? But it definitely is the answer. But I think also we have to look beyond that, because what the quantum does is that it speeds up the algorithm. But if the algorithm is also not optimal, it will do it faster, but we also get the algorithms right. And we need to get the underlying tech, the software that's solving the problems, to do it well. Let me give you an example of what I mean. If we look at the energy consumption of some of the large language models that have been developed recently that facilitate ChatGPT and so on, it's measured in megawatt hours, right? And training these models up, I think it's something like 1,200 megawatt hours, 1,200 megawatts used per hour to train GPT 3.5 or something over about a month and a half, like constantly. So in huge amounts of energy.
Give us like some
So
context. Is
somebody
it
was
like, are we
saying this
powering
week,
the city of New York for a
Yeah,
day or
city level power consumption.
wow.
Yeah, huge amounts, and it's going to get worse because they're getting more and more ambitious. The more recent models have 1 trillion parameters, and the parameters are the tiny things that get adjusted for it to learn what it needs to learn. And the amount of energy and water, by the way, cooling the compute farms down is a major problem, is having an environmental impact that is huge. I've got a student I'm supervising now who's doing an evaluation of that, and it is significant. Now, if we take the human brain, it uses around 20 watt hours. So that's 20 watts. That's about the brightness of a dim bulb, electric light bulb, right? But we learn language, admittedly over a period of years, but still, we don't have anywhere near as much data thrown at us as these language models have. This is my illustration now. If a human brain was to use the same amount of energy that it took to train GPT, do you know how long it would take for that to happen? Over 6 million years,
Wow.
right?
Be
So
one
that
smart
just
guy.
tells you that just tells you that we're doing something wrong, right? And even throwing quantum at that will help, but we also need to address the software issue, the algorithmic issue, and which is one of the areas that we're trying to, in a very small way, trying to address at Oxford Brookes in our research. So I think the human brain is just offers us so much wisdom and ingenuity and creativity that
Mm,
God has put into our ability to perceive and to think that, and we need to learn more from it. We barely scrape the surface. We need to learn
mm.
more from what God did. And as one famous scientist whose name I can't remember said, we need to think God's thoughts after him. What science is about, thinking God's thoughts after him.
I have a follow-up question I want to ask you, Nigel. One of the topics we thought we might cover today, we don't have time to really get into, but you just touched it, so I can't help myself. We've talked before in other calls about how AI is only as good as the source data. It's not creative. It just reshifts and regurgitates the source data you give it. Is there some other version of technology? Is there something that's not this that you think has the potential to be creative? Or will that just never happen? That's only for humans.
So, my perspective on this is that whilst AI technology can generate unique outputs, in other words, it can write prose, it can write stories, it can create artwork that has never been seen before, that's entirely unique. I believe that it's does not come close to what a human being does when they create. And the reason that I think that is that generative AI is just an algorithm. It's just working on statistics, right? It's working on the statistics of the data it's trained on. And what that means is that what it can generate will always be determined by those statistics. And it will not be able to think outside the box and go far beyond what
Yeah,
the statistics tell it.
it's
That's
inherently
just,
derivative.
yeah, it's an inherited derivative. Even if it's unique and never been created before, it's within the statistical properties that it's been trained on. Whereas a human being, with all the wealth of their experience, can still rise above that and do something which is not determined by what they've previously experienced. And I think that's
Mm.
genuine creativity. And I can't envisage any technology being able to do that. And the reason is that, as Ryan was explaining earlier, that we are effectively children of two worlds. We're children of a heaven and earth reality. And that's a deeply integrated reality. And this is where all the quantum stuff becomes very interesting because it's not two separate universes. The Bible always talks about heaven and earth together. The Lord created them, the heavens and the earth. And then in Isaiah, it talks about how there will be a new heaven and a new earth. They'll always come together because they're deeply integrated with each other. So I see that that is important. And that deep integration for us means that we are body and spirit and soul. An algorithm will never have spirit. And the spirit for me is the seat of that creative originality that can push us beyond the boundary of what we've experienced before into something that's entirely new and creative.
Beautiful. I'm glad I asked. All right, let's wrap up with, I want to hear both of you answer this question. If you had to sum up the core message of the two books that you've each written in, let's say, 3 sentences or less, how would you do that? Ryan, you're first. The God of Tech, what's the 3 sentence or less summary?
Oh man, well, it's modern technology. It's divine origin, divine with a capital D, and activating the next great move of God through spirit innovation. And yeah, that's it's kind of a state of the affairs of where we started, where we got off track, and how we get back there in partnership with God to create radical heavenly solutions to solve the world's hardest problems and point to Jesus as the solution that the world is crying out for, and using technology as a tool to do that.
Mm. So if you're a technologist and a believer, in this book you'll find a State of the Union and a call to arms. Yeah. So where do we find it?
Amazon, you can get it, Barnes and Noble, I think anywhere where books are sold online.
Right on. Okay. And Nigel, how about you? Batter up.
Yeah, so for me, it would be that whilst we do have an obligation to equip our AI creations with some moral competence in how they deal with people, I would want the sort of reader of my book to realize that we cannot abdicate our moral responsibility to machines. Humans are moral beings, we're conscious beings, we have empathy, we have understanding, we've got lived experience, and that's what really counts. And what I'd like the reader to go away with is to be less afraid of the technology per se, as long as we develop it well and responsibly, but also to realize just how amazing we are as intelligent beings created by God in his image. And this is his world we're living in. Yeah, it's not our world, it's his world.
Very good. Yeah. So if you're worried about technology's implications, about a road that we're going down, you have a wise man here. He says, sit on my knee, and he gave you some encouragement. There's a little bit of responsibility here, but it's going to be all right. Very good. Cool. Well, Nigel Crook, Ryan Collins, thank you both for your time today. This has been a real joy and a blessing. Maybe we'll do this
Thank
again
you.
someday.
Look forward to it.
All right. Take care, guys.